Alright everybody, hope everyone's doing fine. I am first going to stay off is that I am contradicting myself. I said I was going to leave the short block alone, but in reality for what I'm doing with the thing and how much money it's going to cost me, it's stupid for me not to at least re-bearing it and re-ring it. Eventually this motor will have boost thrown at it, and I don't know what the piston ring gaps are now. Just visually inspecting this whole motor, there is no ring gap. This cylinder has some rust pitting in it, but that's because of me when I washed it. But it doesn't look bad. This piston had something ingested in with it, but it's not terrible. It's only around the edges here. This is the one that had the crack, so I'm thinking the crack, something ingested in here, but it's not terribly bad damage. I'll probably smoothen this top of this piston out when I pop it out, and then re-ring it, gap them, and throw it back together. All the rest of the pistons look good. Again, no ring ridge. I pulled one bearing, one main cap bearing, and the bearings actually look pretty dang good. So I'm going to turn this over. I started tearing this thing apart even more. And as I said, all I'm going to do is re-bearing it and re-ring it and run it. I'm going to gap the rings bigger than what the specification is because eventually boost will go through here. And when you look at everything, there's some heat in some of these pistons. This number, what is that? That's 1, that's 4. Number 4 piston looks like it had the most heat in it. And 5 looks fine. 6 got some heat in it. 2 got some heat. 3, I'm sticking with just re-ringing it and running it. This engine barely has any wear from what I can tell without actually using actual measurement tools. Oil pump's off. The oil pump drive goes down through there. I'm going to take the windage tray off. Just be a note, when you do rip this motor apart, every single piston has to go back in the exact same spot. They're made to be for that size bore. Before I turned it over, I should have showed you. Where is it? Right there. Right where the shiny part of the light is. I don't know if you can see that. There's an arrow. Points to the front of the motor. And if you look down here, they stamped it. Number 1 piston, number 1 rod. Right on there it says number 1. And you got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Passenger side's 1, 2, 3. Driver side's 4, 5, 6. Pistons go in a certain way. The rods have to go on a certain way. They only go on one way. Same with the main caps. They all go on one way. But I have to order rings, bearings, and I gotta know exactly what size to order. And being that this motor has actual Ford bearings in it, this motor has never been apart. So standard bearings, standard ring size, and then I'll gap them. But I am ripping this apart to re-ring it and re-bearing it and slap it back together. Not the correct way to do this, but it is a way to do this because I see nothing wrong with this motor and everything's in pretty nice shape. So after the camera died there, I still want to go over the fact that the things that I've found in this motor running 200,000 miles, the wear I found, the reason behind I'm doing everything, and what I'm doing to it. I want to explain which will be pictures as I'm talking about all this. But to explain everything, this is what I found, and this is what I'm doing and why I'm doing things. So, to start off with the cylinder bores, there's little to no wear to them. When you look in the cylinder bores and you look at the ring ridge, see how bad it is, there is no ring ridge in this engine. Even after 200,000 miles, the engine looks really good, and there is no wear for the finger to feel with the ring ridge. It's a good gauge you can use, the ring ridge at the top of the cylinder. So, with that said, the cylinder, from what I see by the pistons, with the skirt, there's little to no wear on any of them. It's all really good. Decent. I see no issues even with the pistons, other than some oil caked up, sludged around the oil control rings. Some of the piston rings, probably from sitting, seized in the piston a little bit, but I was able to free them with like very, very little effort. There's some heat in all these pistons, but not enough for me to really condemn it, to really change them. So, because I'll be eventually boosting this engine, and for time, money, and reasons that way, to keep this engine from blowing up and give it the best possible fight for what abuse I'm about to put it through, to keep it from blowing up, but it will be inevitable, it will blow up, is changing these piston rings. Not only boring out or rehoning, not boring, where I'm going to be rehoning it with a dingle ball to create a new surface for new rings to meet up against, and set the ring gap to about 25 to 26 thousandths of an inch, which is out of the quote-unquote spec, but this engine is going to be under different parameters than stock, because when it boosts, it creates higher temperatures, pressures, to where the ring gap, I want to keep the ring gap from touching each other. There, that ring gap from touching each other and blowing the piston upwards into the cylinder, causing a whole bunch of damage, and give the engine the best possible chance of surviving. That's going to be one area of failure in which I'm going to try and help this engine survive. Second is, out of all the bearings in this engine, the only bearings that show any sort of alarming wear that reckon that they have to be changed are the rod bearings. Right where the power stroke happens, I'll have better pictures. You can kind of see the wear of the first layer gone, and a spot of bronze popping through, just like I said before earlier in the video. This engine has a notorious, or most of Ford engines have notorious of having too little of oil pressure and not enough oil volume to the surfaces that need it. Now granted, this happened over 200,000 miles. You can run it, but the big problem with this engine is it has too little of oil delivery to the top end. That's why a lot of these engines are so underpowered. The lifters collapse, the rocker arms get gouged out because lack of oil just makes them tick like crazy, don't open up the valve enough, and just, they're a pain. They're a dog, reliable, inefficient dog. and they're awful at making power. So I want to just try and experiment and see what I can do to help this motor. Now, this thing definitely needs to have rod bearings. Main bearings, they look okay, but I am not reusing any bearings. It's got standard bearings in it. Buy standard bearings, put them on, check it with Plasti-Gauge, and then it should be good, and we'll send it. The crank don't look bad. There's no scratches. There's no deep grooves that stop with your finger. Generally, you would want it polished, but I don't see enough damage to the crank to get it polished. There's not enough wear. Other than this bearing wear here, there's no real alarming bearing wear in the whole engine. And this is typical. This is typical in the rods. So the other thing I'm doing with the rods, before I forget, is that the second area in which these engines fail, and it's generally if you're spinning the thing faster than 5,500 RPM, is that these rod bolts break. Now, because I'm using an OHV and the cam I'm using, this engine probably will never spin faster than 5,300 RPM. It's not worth it. The engine can't pump air that fast. The design of the engine is just awful for that. It probably will never happen. But because I am going to be throwing so much abuse at this engine, I am going to be putting, I think it's ARP rod bolts in this, which you'll see later down the road when I reassemble the short block. Rod bolts are the second area in which they fail. First is the piston with the rings, and second, it's the rod bolts. Now, most of the time, these things fail due to high RPM. They were not meant to go past, at least this engine, really not meant to go past 5,500. The single overhead cams, 4 liters, you can push to 6,000, 6,500 RPM. By the design of the air for the cylinder heads, you can push it that fast. But I'm using an OHV version for simplicity and cheapness, because you can rip apart one of these engines in literally an hour. It's not hard. And they're cheap. They're so cheap. So put money into this motor in key areas to make it last longer, but I'm also going to experiment with it. But that's the piston and rods, what I'm doing. So we're changing the rings, we're going to re-hone the cylinders, change the rings, re-gap them to a much larger gap, more than stock, because it will be boosted later on. But in naturally aspirated form, it should be okay. We might have a little bit more cylinder crankcase pressure, but that'll be okay. It's not going to hurt it. The rings will manage, being that it's going to be new oil, and the surfaces. I'm going to be cleaning these up at work, quite a bit dirty, and taking the rings off. Bearings are getting thrown out. Yada yada. That's what's going to happen with this in the short block. So now you kind of hear me talking about oil delivery issues. Ford has a chronic problem. Multiple engines, Triton engines, single overhead cam engines even. They all have, Ford constantly, chronically has a problem with putting too small of an oil pump in their engines. Period. The volume does not put out what the engine needs. This engine needs a higher volume oil pump. Sort of the reason why I have wear on them rod bearings in there. It doesn't have the oil it needs. It squishes most of the oil out to where you get that beat up wear. This oil pump can't even deliver the suffice amount of oil to the top end valve train, which is why all the valve rocker arms get gouged out and can't open the valve enough. And being I'm putting a new cam in this, it's very, very good to just put a higher volume oil pump in this. On top of, I probably am going to guess, clearances are all a bit worn more. Again, I'll check it with plastic gauge. But if you kind of just look, you run your finger on all these journals. That's whoa. 1, 4 main bearing. That's 2, 5 journal, main bearing, and then 3 and 6 rod journal. You run your finger on all these. There is no scratching in this. There is no deep grooves. This crank is dang right perfect for being 200,000 miles. So I'm not polishing this. I'm not doing anything to this crank other than slapping new bearings on it. Now I will make a whole assembly short block video eventually. But the biggest problem I'm having now is I'm waiting on parts. Everything for this engine is back ordered. Being the limit on how much aftermarket and support there is for this engine, everything is back ordered. Because not a lot of people put money into this motor, which I understand why. I'm only doing this to a certain point just for research and development reasons, to see what I can do with what's out there. Just to be different. I'm not going to put an LS in this. I really don't want to. LSs are great. They have my respect in terms of packaging, power, and efficiency. An LS is dang right good at what it does. But it's also expensive. Even in doing a junkyard swap, it comes to a point where time to rip apart the dash, time to make a harness, all the other aspects about it, the amount of time, work into putting a different drivetrain in here, on top of me putting suspension on the truck. I don't have that money. Don't have that time. I don't want to do that at this point in time. I want to play with the 4-liter, see what I can get it to do, and put the information out there if someone wants to copy me. So, out of all the wear and everything I see with this motor, it needs rod bearings, but I'm changing them all. The pistons are not that worn. The rings are getting changed and regapped, and the cylinders are getting rehoned for the little bit of rust that's in there from when I washed it. So the rust isn't bad. It's all surface. There's no, you can barely even feel it with your finger, because it's oil and all the oil in it from it's sitting over there in oil soaked rags in a bag. But this is the status of the engine. I am still waiting on parts. I have heads at the machine shop for getting work done for the new cam to put in. I'll go over the costs when I do the whole short block assembly, probably over multiple videos. I'll see how I'll set it up, but to get an idea, I'm waiting for back ordered parts, because everything is constantly back ordered for anything for this motor. And with that time, I have a full-time job, so I get to this when I can get to it. I try and store these things in a way that don't make it difficult for me. That's why crank's in a trash bag, still covered in oil. Just everything's still just covered in oil.